Europe and the US decoupling, Europe having to do a lot more on its own, the kind of autonomy with which it has to act, the kind of influence it now has to impose upon its own sphere, the Atlantic, Russian border, Mediterranean. Europe has to think very differently about things to the United States.
Now, Donald Trump's summit with President Zelensky and the European leaders begins, of course, in just a couple of hours. But regardless of the outcome, one thing is very clear. American unreliability means that Europe is rearming. Money is pouring into weapons industries as governments acknowledge that we are living in difficult, very, very challenging, insecure times. Let's talk to Henry Palmer, who's a venture capitalist and founder of the defence and supply chain fund, Lightridge. Now, first of all, Henry, tell us a bit about Lightridge. What exactly do you do?
Well, Lightridge is an early stage venture capital firm, so we invest both in the US and UK and German markets predominantly. And we're very thematic. So we think about industrial resilience and security and target areas like materials, advanced manufacturing, logistics, dual purpose defense, really trying to drive innovation technology into those areas of the supply chain that we think are not only critical for the resilience of those economies and the security of those nation states, but also ultimately present a massive opportunity as we find ourselves in this transformational period. We think very much in like long arcs. It's, as you'll know, venture capital, you're investing over 7-10 year horizons. Mm-hmm. So what we see is the breakdown of Pax Americana, the ending of this sort of unipolar world.
Right, which gives investors, organisations like your own, funds, the opportunity to invest in what and where?
So, to give you an example, we could look at, in the materials space, the emergence of things like biosynthetics, the role of lab automation and robotics and AI, how this is stimulating entirely new areas of advanced alternative materials, and the various different ways in which that can mean transformational changes in our supply chain. So a very topical example would be things like REEs, rare earths, the ways in which we refine those materials, the way in which we mine, or indeed entire alternatives to those materials.
We are told there are lots of those in parts of Ukraine.
Indeed. And, I think this is one of always the interesting things that we have to grapple with when we look at each of these markets. You mentioned, Europe and the US decoupling, Europe having to do a lot more on its own, the kind of autonomy with which it has to act, the kind of influence it now has to impose upon its own sphere, the Atlantic, Russian border, Mediterranean. Europe has to think very differently about things to the United States. It has a different economy. It has different materials, different resources available to it. So, when we're investing, whether that's into the UK, German market, we think slightly differently than, say, if we were pursuing opportunities in the United States.
Right. But if you were, in very simple terms, for our listeners, many of whom might be thinking about retirement or thinking about their financial prospects for retirement, is now about the best time there's ever been to start investing in the defence industry?
Well, I can't advise, or give sort of specific financial advice to anybody. But, for our fund, we very much look at a series of sort of emerging technologies around biosynthetics, AI, compute, the way in which these are going to transfer our economies, and then the impact those will have in different areas. I think defense, we all know Europe has increased its defense spending by 30% over the last couple of years. Interestingly, though, corresponding to that, output has not necessarily kept up. So sometimes you might look at a trend, say, on the defense side, and see an opportunity as a venture fund to invest. But correspondingly with that, you also need to invest into industrial capacity, manufacturing technologies, and so on, and the capacity and infrastructure that you need to support that and create the output at the same time. So, very much all of these things are sort of interconnected.
Right. Does the defence industry in this country feel supported? I was going to say, does it feel loved? Because let's be honest, it's not particularly cuddly. In fact, some people find the whole thing abhorrent. What would you say about how it feels, about what other people think of it?
Well, I think everybody has to take their own sort of ethical stance.
Yeah.
Generally, I believe the liberal democracies that we have the institutions that we have and the sort of privileges and rights we have require the ability to defend them. And that means that we have to do the dirty work of investing into these technologies and developing at the same time. So for me, the moral position is relatively clear, but every individual will have their own take. That being said, I think it is impossible not to recognize the more hostile world, that we're living in. And I think you have to face that with a certain amount of realism. One other thing that I think is often forgotten about defense is, of course, there's the production of specific weapons and weapons technologies. Defense has been one of the largest drivers of R&D and innovation of the 20th and 21st century of almost any sector. So to name a couple of examples, the internet being one of the most obvious.
Explain its origins were something to do with the American Navy. Is that?
Yeah, it came out of R&D programs in the United States, largely to build an alternative communication platform, and the internet was the result of that. I always. This is where we very much think of defense in dual purpose terms, right? That you get a push-pull both from the civilian and the defense sectors when it comes to driving innovation that can have massive benefits for our economy, for our society, and so on at the same time. Another example I always love is the touchscreens that go into our iPhones. That technology was largely invented in the US by Lockheed Martin and others in order to support fighter pilots operating in their jets. It took Steve Jobs and Apple to figure out how to put that into a consumer product and how to build a platform on top of it. But I don't think we should underestimate the importance that defense plays in multiple different areas of our economy.
Okay, and just very briefly, in the incredibly limited amount of time available, have the phones at your company been running pretty hot? Have people been desperate to get in touch?
Well,
because things are so terrible, frankly, because things look so bleak, is there bound to be increased interest in exactly what it is you're doing?
Absolutely. I think it's taken a little time, but in the same way that we see our politicians and our governments in Europe waking up to the new reality, so are ordinary people in the market, other investment firms, and indeed many founders. I think one of the things that's been very interesting and exciting to see is that a great wave of talent, in their early 20s, entire new generation, who are ready to tackle, what we think of as sort of hard tech areas, in building new technology companies inside manufacturing, inside materials, inside, defense sectors, in a way that maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they wouldn't have. And I think this is a reflection of the sort of urgency and need that people feel, but also the fact that, it's an entire different topic we could spend another 10 minutes or half an hour, hours on even. But AI has been proliferating through the software realm, but we're starting to see its impact on the atoms as well as the bits. And that, I think, is going to be transformational over the next decade.
Really interesting. Thank you very much indeed. That's Henry Palmer. He is the founder of the defence and supply chain fund Lightridge.